Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you're watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. He asked for help, and I wasn't ready. I still remember that day like it was folded neatly between the pages of my life, waiting for me to open it again. The afternoon light was thin and golden, the kind that makes even old things look beautiful for a moment. I had just finished my second cup of coffee and was sorting through old letters, things I hadn't looked at in years, when the phone rang. It was Michael. We hadn't spoken properly in months, not since the day he moved back into town after his wife passed away. I remember hearing his voice, calm, quiet, but with something trembling underneath it. He said he needed help. Just that. Help. No details, no explanations. And for a moment, I froze. You see, Michael had been a part of my life for so long that even silence between us carried meaning. We had grown up together, spent our youth dreaming of cities we never reached, and then life pulled us apart. I got married, raised 2 children, and built a life around responsibilities. He built his around his wife, his work, and eventually his grief. When he called, my first instinct was to say yes. But I didn't. I wasn't ready, not for him, not for the flood of memories, not for the part of myself I'd tucked away so carefully over the years. He said, "It's nothing dramatic. I just need a hand with something in the old house." The old house. That phrase alone felt heavy. It was his parents' place, the same one where we'd sat on the porch at 17, talking about everything and nothing. I told him I'd think about it. And that night, as the house got quiet and the wind pressed gently against the windows, I kept hearing his voice in my mind. The way it softened when he said help. There was something in it, a tiredness I couldn't ignore. By morning, I found myself driving toward that street I hadn't seen in years. The road felt shorter than I remembered, but every turn brought back pieces of the past I thought I'd forgotten. The house looked almost the same, except the garden was overgrown and the paint had begun to peel around the edges. He opened the door before I even knocked. For a second, I didn't recognize him. His hair was grayer, his eyes quieter, his smile slower. But it was still him. "Didn't think you'd actually come," he said, half a smile breaking through. "Neither did I admitted, and we both laughed awkwardly, like strangers trying to find old ground. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The furniture was covered with white sheets, the kind that try to protect things from time but never really can. He led me to the back room, where boxes were stacked high against the walls. "I've been trying to clean it out," he said. "It's harder than I thought. My hands just stop sometimes." I looked at him then, really looked. His shoulders were slightly hunched, like he was carrying something too heavy to set down. I wanted to say something comforting, but words felt too small. So I did what felt natural. I started unpacking. Old photographs, yellowed newspapers, a cracked frame with his parents' wedding picture. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was full, almost sacred. "After a while," he said quietly, "you always knew how to make things less heavy." I smiled without looking up. "Maybe I just distract you enough so you forget how heavy they are." He laughed softly, and the sound filled the room like light. But beneath it, there was that quiet tension, the kind that comes from things left unsaid. We both knew this wasn't just about cleaning a room. It was about clearing something much deeper. As the sun began to set, I stood by the window, watching the light stretch across the old garden. He came to stand beside me, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his presence but not close enough to cross the line between past and present. "I didn't know who else to call," he said finally. "You were always the one who showed up when it mattered." That caught me off guard. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't that person anymore, that life had changed me, made me cautious, made me build walls. But instead, I said, "Sometimes we forget who we are until someone reminds us." He looked at me then, his eyes reflecting that same fading sunlight outside. "Maybe that's why I called." We stood there in silence for a long moment, both of us holding something unspoken between us. I realized then that sometimes help isn't about fixing things, it's about standing next to someone while they try. When I finally left that evening, the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. He walked me to my car, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets like he was holding back 100 things he wanted to say. "Thank you," he said simply. I nodded, my throat tight. "You're welcome." As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, standing there under the porch light. It struck me that maybe I hadn't been ready to help him because I wasn't ready to face the version of myself that still cared so deeply. That night, lying in bed, I realized something I hadn't before, that readiness doesn't always come before the moment. Sometimes, it finds you in the middle of it, and that was only the beginning. He asked for help, and I wasn't ready. But after that day, it felt like something inside me had quietly shifted. For the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about him or that house. Every little thing seemed to pull me back there: the sound of creaking floors in my own home, the smell of old coffee, even the way the light hit the kitchen counter in the late afternoon. I kept telling myself it was just nostalgia, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. On Thursday, he called again. I recognized the number before I picked up, and still, my heart raced like it used to when we were young. His voice was lighter this time. "I found more boxes," he said. "You busy this weekend?" I hesitated. I had plans, or at least, I told myself I did. Laundry, groceries, the kind of ordinary things that make it easier to avoid what really matters. But the truth was, I wanted to see him again. I wanted to feel useful. "I can come by Saturday," I said, pretending to sound casual. "Same time?" "Yes," I replied. "Same time." When Saturday came, the sky was overcast, a soft grey blanket hanging over the town. The drive felt easier this time, like my heart had already accepted what my mind was still trying to reason with. He met me at the door again, wearing that same old denim shirt he'd always favored. "You brought coffee?" he asked with a grin. "Of course," I said. Some things never change. Inside, the house looked a little different. He'd cleared out some of the clutter. The living room had a faint warmth to it now, like it was slowly remembering how to be lived in. We worked side by side for hours, sorting through memories that didn't belong to us but somehow felt familiar. Every photograph, every book, every faded ticket stub told a story. He would pause sometimes, looking at something quietly before placing it gently into a box. After a while, he found an old record player. "Remember this?" he asked, wiping the dust from its lid. "I didn't know you still had it," I said, surprised. He smiled, that slow, careful smile of his. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Too many songs tied to it. He put on a record, and the sound crackled softly before music filled the room, a low, nostalgic tune that made the air feel heavier, but in a comforting way. We didn't talk for a while. We just listened. Then he said, almost under his breath, "It's strange, isn't it? How sound can bring people back." I looked at him, but he was staring at the window, his reflection faint in the glass. "It doesn't just bring people back," I said softly. "It brings back the parts of us we thought we lost." He turned then, meeting my gaze, and for a moment I could see all the years between us, everything we'd been, and everything we weren't anymore. There was something deeply human in that silence. Something fragile. We spent the rest of the afternoon packing, laughing sometimes, and sharing little stories that had no real purpose except to fill the space between us. But when the sun began to set, a gentle stillness came over the house again. He poured us each a cup of tea and we sat on the back porch. The old wood creaked beneath our chairs. Beyond the fence, the trees swayed softly in the evening breeze. "I thought I'd be okay doing this alone," he said quietly. But I wasn't. "It's harder to face the quiet than I thought." I nodded. "It's strange how the quiet can be so loud." He smiled faintly. "You always had a way of saying the right thing." I didn't feel like I did. Most of the time, I felt like I was just stumbling through moments, trying not to break anything, especially my own heart. He leaned back, staring out at the fading light. "Do you ever think about how life turns out? How we end up in places we never planned to be?" "All the time," I said. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe we're supposed to end up exactly where we don't expect to." He looked at me then, and there was something raw in his eyes, something that made me feel like time had folded in on itself and we were just two young souls again, sitting on a porch, wondering what would come next. I wanted to tell him I still cared, that I never really stopped. But I didn't. Because sometimes caring quietly is enough. When I left that evening, he walked me to my car again. "But this time," he said, "can you come next weekend too? I think I need a bit more help." I smiled. "You just like having someone to talk to while you procrastinate." He laughed softly. "Maybe." As I drove home, the first raindrops began to fall, tiny patterns against the windshield. I thought about his words, about how hard it is to face the quiet. And I realized he wasn't the only one avoiding it. That night, I sat in my living room, the lights dim, the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows. For the first time in years, I didn't turn on the television or pick up my phone. I just sat there, listening to the quiet he'd spoken of, and in that silence, I understood why I hadn't been ready before. Because helping someone heal meant revisiting your own wounds too, but maybe that's what healing really is: two people standing in the wreckage, trying to build something steady again, even if it's just for a little while. And somehow, I knew I'd be back next weekend. He asked for help, and I wasn't ready. But by the third weekend, I realized something: maybe it wasn't just him who needed the help. Maybe it was me too. Saturday morning arrived slower than usual. The kind of quiet morning where the world feels half asleep. I made my coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and stared out at the grey sky. I don't know what I was waiting for: a sign, maybe, or just the courage to keep showing up for someone who reminded me of everything I'd buried deep. When I pulled up to his house, the air smelled of rain and old pine. The porch light was already on, though it was barely noon. Michael opened the door before I could even knock, like he'd been standing there, listening for my car. "You're early," he said, smiling, though his eyes looked tired. "Couldn't sleep," I said, and handed him a small paper bag. "I brought pie." He laughed softly. "You're trying to bribe me into being productive again, huh?" "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just needed an excuse to bake." The house looked warmer now. Some of the boxes were gone, the curtains had been washed, and a faint smell of cedar polish lingered in the air. The walls still carried the echo of old memories, but something about them felt lighter, like they were starting to breathe again. We settled into the rhythm we'd quietly built over the past 2 weeks. He sorted through papers and tools while I wiped the dust off old frames and stacked books in neat little piles. Every now and then, we'd exchange a word, a laugh, or just a look that said more than we dared to speak. Around noon, he said, "You don't have to keep coming, you know. You've already done more than enough." I didn't answer right away. I just kept folding a yellowed tablecloth, smoothing out the creases that time had left. Then I said quietly, "Maybe I need this as much as you do." He paused, his hand resting on the edge of a box. "Need what?" "The reminder," I said. "That some things are still worth showing up for." He didn't reply, but the look he gave me said everything. Gratitude. Sadness. Maybe a bit of guilt, too. But mostly, understanding. We took a break in the afternoon and sat outside with our coffee. The air was crisp, and the wind played gently with the loose strands of my hair. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You know, I used to think losing her was the end of everything." I looked at him carefully. "And now?" He took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the yard where the autumn leaves had started to fall. "Now I think, maybe it was just the end of what I knew. Not the end of everything." I nodded slowly. "Grief doesn't end, Michael. It just changes shape." He looked at me with a quiet intensity. "Did it change for you?" It was my turn to look away. "Yes. Eventually. But it took years to understand that moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It just means choosing to live again." He didn't say anything after that, but I could tell my words had landed somewhere deep. He was the kind of man who felt everything quietly, letting it sink in before he spoke again. By evening, the house looked almost different. The clutter was gone, the light had changed. It was no longer just a place of memories, it was beginning to feel like a home again. He walked me to the door, as always. But this time, he stopped me before I could leave. "Can I show you something?" he asked. He led me upstairs, to a room I hadn't seen before. It was his old study. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a single window let in a soft golden glow from the setting sun. On the desk was a half-finished painting. "I didn't know you still painted," I said quietly. "I stopped for a long time," he replied. "After she passed, it just felt wrong to keep doing the things that made me happy." The canvas was rough but alive. It showed the porch, the trees, and the faint silhouette of 2 chairs side by side. He'd captured the light perfectly, the kind of light that feels both real and remembered. "It's beautiful," I said. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "It's not finished." "Neither are you," I whispered, though I wasn't sure he heard me. He looked at the painting for a long moment before turning to me. "You've helped me remember what this feels like. Creating something. Living again." My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't find the right words. So I just said, "Then maybe that's your next step." He nodded, and his smile grew a little. "Only if you promise to keep showing up." I laughed softly. You really don't want to learn how to clean on your own, do you? He chuckled. Not if it means you'll stop coming. Something in the air shifted after that, a quiet understanding that what we were building wasn't just friendship or shared history. It was something fragile and deeply human. A reminder that even after loss, people can find ways to reach each other again. As I drove home that night, I caught sight of the sunset in my rearview mirror. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, like a promise of something gentler ahead. I realized then that I wasn't helping Michael out of obligation anymore. I was helping him because, in some way, he was helping me too, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from the quiet. I was walking toward it, one visit, one box, one conversation at a time. He asked for help, and I wasn't ready. But by the time the last visit came, I realized readiness had nothing to do with time, it had to do with acceptance. It was a bright Sunday morning, colder than the others had been. The trees had almost lost all their leaves, and the street in front of Michael's house was covered in soft shades of amber and brown. I parked a little farther than usual, just so I could walk that final stretch slowly. Something in me wanted to take it all into the air, the light, even the quiet hum of the town waking up. When I reached the porch, he was already waiting there, a paintbrush in one hand, a small streak of green across his sleeve. "You're early," he said with a smile that reached his eyes this time. "So are you," I replied. "You've been painting again?" He nodded. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get started before you showed up and told me to move the canvas near the light." I laughed softly. "So you do listen when I talk?" "Only sometimes," he teased. Inside, the house no longer felt like a space filled with loss. The boxes were gone, replaced by life, small signs of it everywhere. A vase of wildflowers sat on the kitchen table. A blanket was draped across the arm of the couch. The radio played softly from the corner, an old song from the 70s that made me smile. "It looks like a home again," I said quietly. He looked around and nodded. "It does. And I wouldn't have done it without you." We spent most of the day finishing what little was left. Folding a few blankets, cleaning the study windows, rearranging books. But there was something different in the air, an awareness that we were nearing the end of this quiet chapter we'd built together. Neither of us said it, but I think we both felt it. Around noon, I found myself standing in front of the painting he'd been working on. It was finished now. The porch, the chairs, the trees, they were all there, but there was something new too. A second figure. A woman sitting beside the man, her head slightly turned toward him, the light catching her face just so that I didn't need to ask who it was meant to be. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped beside me. "I wasn't sure if I should add her," he said quietly. "But it didn't feel right leaving her out." I turned to him and smiled gently. "You didn't just paint her, Michael. You painted peace." He let out a slow breath, and for a moment we stood there, side by side, not as two people bound by the past, but as two people finally free of it. We made tea and sat on the porch afterward, the same spot we had stood on that very first day. The air was cold, the kind that bites at your fingertips, but neither of us seemed to mind. The sun was setting slowly behind the trees, casting everything in that familiar golden light that always made time feel softer. "You know," he said after a long pause, "when I first called you, I didn't think you'd come. I didn't know who else to reach out to." I smiled faintly. "And now I think I understand that sometimes help comes from the people who weren't ready but showed up anyway." His words stayed with me. They reminded me that life doesn't wait for perfect timing, it waits for courage. I looked at him, his hands wrapped around the mug, his eyes tired but full of life again. "You found your way back," I said. He nodded. "And you helped me remember mine." The wind rustled through the trees then, scattering the last of the leaves across the porch. For a moment, I felt the weight of everything we had shared, the laughter, the silences, the small, unspoken kindnesses that stitched two lonely hearts back together, not into something romantic, but something steady. Something human. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car one last time. The same way he always did. But this time, he didn't just say goodbye. He handed me a small envelope. "Open it when you get home," he said. I wanted to ask what it was, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was tender, final, and full of quiet gratitude. So I just nodded, smiled, and said, "See you around, Michael." He smiled back. "You always did know how to say things like you meant them." As I drove away, I watched him in the mirror until he disappeared behind the curve of the road. The world outside felt lighter somehow, As if letting go didn't mean losing, it meant making space for something new. When I got home, I sat on the couch and opened the envelope. Inside was a small watercolor painting. It was simple, 2 cups of coffee sitting side by side on a porch railing, the morning light spilling gently across them. Underneath, in his familiar handwriting, he had written, "For the one who showed up." I don't know how long I sat there holding it, but I know I cried. Not from sadness, but from the kind of quiet peace that comes after a long storm. That night, I hung the painting in my kitchen, right above the window where the morning light always falls. And every day since, it's reminded me of something I'll never forget. Sometimes, the help we offer others becomes the healing we didn't know we needed. And even when we're not ready, love in its purest, simplest form has a way of finding us anyway.